All right. Oh.
Hey everyone, how is everyone doing today?
Good.
Lots of excited faces.
Anyone else go to the Maple Leaf last night? See Rebirth? Good to be in New Orleans.
All right, guys. So right now, the question of media credibility is more important than ever. Fake news and the topic of fake news seems to be something that we can't escape, we can't get away from. We hear it quite often from the current administration in the US, specifically Donald Trump. And so we have two media heavy hitters here to kind of discuss the issue and what the potential solutions could be if fake news is a problem. So, John, I'm going to start with you. Give me your opinion on fake news, because there is a little bit of a division among Americans as to whether or not fake news is really a thing. Does it really exist, or is it just an excuse used by politicians to minimize negative news coverage?
Well, first of all, fake news is a real problem, there's no question, but I think we need to define the terms really clearly, because it is not what some folks would like to sell it as. Fake news I define as fundamentally false stories that are written with the intent to deceive, right? They may have a propagandistic purpose, sometimes they may be just fueled by profit, but this is something that has become epidemic. It's calculated misinformation. What fake news is not is what President Trump and the White House crew are trying to sell, which is any news that might be critical of them, news that offends you somehow, personally or politically. That's an Orwellian attempt to blur basic distinctions between fact and fiction, between truth and lies. That's incredibly dangerous to start muddying the waters, but that is its explicit intent, and I think that's just a measure of how serious the times we're in right now are, that's something we're debating with pushback, an agenda-driven pushback from the White House.
So, Jared, there seems to be a little bit of an issue deciphering the difference between the type of fake news that John just perfectly laid out and, news reports that might be wrong on some of the facts, right? And everyone in the media at some point in their careers makes a mistake, they get a fact wrong, they report it, and the right thing is to retract it, right? And so how do we get the American people to understand the difference between intentional fake news and reporting that has the best intentions but maybe got some of the facts wrong?
I think part of it is actually that word intention, because I think where we have arrived is at a point where there's a line between bias in the media and fake. Mm-hmm. And I think in a world that's becoming increasingly more polarized politically, this concept of bias is what's polluting the conversation. And if you think about it, how do we as people actually access the news and the information that we consume on a daily basis? Mm-hmm. And as the world has shifted to digital, and within digital to mobile, the two dominant platforms where people access news is really through search and through social. And when you're in search, you are explicitly seeking something. I have an intention of what I'm looking for, and somebody delivers what I'm looking for. So my own personal biases get reinforced in what I'm looking for. If you think about social, the very concept of social is, what do all the people in my network consume, and is that relevant to me? And that kind of reaffirms biases that I may have. Like, maybe I'm friends with people who don't have any common interests or thought process as I do, but most people actually are friends with people who are more similar to them than not. So you have this self-reinforcing issue in terms of how we consume it. And so the platforms who are behind this are working very hard at trying to sort of solve that issue of bias at the platform level. On the same token, as publishers of content, there are either explicit or latent biases in terms of journalistic enterprises. And some media organizations skew more conservative, some skew more liberal, some skew more for millennials, some skew for different demographics. And I think it's okay to have a point of view on the world. And in fact, consumers want to, and people want to know that the people who are delivering the information have a point of view. I think in that regard, it's really, really important for a publication and for the writers to be very transparent about where they're coming from, what their intentions are, and what their backgrounds are. It's why a lot of the best journalistic enterprises make the bios of the authors really front and center, so you can really, as a person, understand where they're coming from. And I think having that knowledge is really, really important. Of course, people get stuff wrong, and whether you're an athlete, which we just heard about, or whether you're a journalist, you may not get the facts right all the time, but then it's up to the writer and the news organization to correct that. So I think when you put those two things together, it's why people are not so much because of fake news, although that doesn't help, but also this concept of bias on both the platform layer and the publication layer.
So I love that you brought that up, because when I was in journalism school, the biggest no-no once you're out there on the field is sharing your opinion. And I remember one of my favorite journalism professors telling me, do not ever share your opinion until you pay your dues and you are credible enough to be an op-ed writer or something like that. But the media landscape is changing, and it's changing rapidly. People do want a point of view. And John, you published a book about wingnuts, and
Yes,
I found it fascinating because we do have a very polarized political system right now. And at first, I was under the assumption that, hey, maybe it's because of some of the media players and the shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh that are playing a role in polarizing people. But it seems like there is a hunger for biased media. People, as you just mentioned, Jared, are looking for information that reinforces their preconceived notions, right? And I think that that has kind of created a system that allows something like fake news to thrive. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there are a lot of sort of macro dynamics that have gotten us to this point. Partisan news and polarization of society and hyperpartisan politics all are self-reinforcing, right? And in the macro sense, you get the fragmentation of the media environment that has unfortunately, instead of allowing everyone to sort of take advantage of the democratization of media to access a wider array of opinions than ever before, too often we self-segregate into separate political realities. And this all of a sudden can start reinforcing hyperpartisanship and polarization in Congress, this idea of us against them. It undercuts sort of the essential idea behind democracy, which is an assumption of goodwill among fellow citizens. And I think a lot of the technological trends that Jared described, I think are driving it too, because part of what fake news is, it's sort of confirmation bias meets clickbait. And it sort of takes that DNA of partisan news and it sends it into the absurd, but it becomes incredibly toxic, incredibly radioactive. So I think the larger lack of trust in news media has been increasing for, unfortunately, decades. It predates social media, it predates fake news, but that's the foundation of it. And so at the Daily Beast, for example, we try very hard to be nonpartisan but not neutral. What does that mean? It means we will hit both sides as appropriate, that we have columnists who range liberal to libertarian, that we try to be transparent, we try to be edgy, but you always balance the attitude with accuracy. What we don't do, and what I think is incredibly dangerous, is this sort of, on the one hand, on the other, myth of moral equivalence on every issue. Because once you start buying into that, then that itself becomes muddying about the line between truth and lies, fact and fiction. And that's something we as journalists need to be pushing back on. We need to be unapologetic about pushing a fact-based debate and be transparent about opinions and perspectives when they exist.
Right, and I think that's a really important point, because one of the biggest issues in the media was that journalists were confusing the importance of objectivity with neutrality.
Right.
And so they treated both sides as if they're completely equal, they're both saying one thing or the other, and then it's up to you to decide who's telling the truth. And again, I think that played a role in people getting really frustrated with establishment media or traditional media, and then they turned to some more obscure independent sources. So all these little things did play a role, in my opinion, as to how fake news emerged and how it became so influential.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how influential it really is, because I think there are some disagreements as to how much of an impact, how many ramifications we've experienced as a result of misleading or fake news. So do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, look, this became epidemic in a relatively short period of time, which is one of the reasons why I think we were ill-equipped to deal with it. I mean, misinformation campaigns, the purchasing of bots to try to depress turnout or confuse people as to facts. That's something that we have seen, unfortunately, primarily in other democracies more so than our own. And I think, one of the many factors that led to this perfect storm that had an impact on the election was sort of, Facebook kind of pulling the goalie when it came to some of the people who were individually curating articles out of concern that there was individual bias. And all of a sudden, what flowed in was a massive amount of fake news that people weren't prepared on the platforms to try to adjudicate. So we know fake news was getting shared more often than real news in those critical closing months and weeks of the election. And I'll say that there's a brand new Kennedy School of Government report about the rise of fake news that I recommend. People are trying to fix this on different fronts. Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia is trying to launch an initiative. And I think we all need to take it seriously, but it really, it happens so quickly that it overwhelmed a lot of the people who'd normally be there to adjudicate it. And that's one of the reasons, given the election results were so tight, you can't pinpoint one thing. But it can have a demonstrable effect on our democracy, and it's happening in the French election right now. So yes, it's real. The dynamics we need to understand, and then we need to aggressively confront them as journalists, as businesses, as advertisers, as academics. Like, we all need to have a multi-front push on this right now because it's impacting our democracy in real time.
Jared, what stood out to you the most in regard to fake news during this past election? Was there something that spread that had a serious impact that you were concerned about?
Well, one thing to consider is whether it's this election or other elections, and even in this conversation of fake news and legitimate news, is the number of people in this country and around the world who we like to refer to as unnewsed or undernewsed, which is people who are actually who don't feel part of the system at all. They're both disenfranchised from a voting perspective, but also disenfranchised from the powers and structures of the society around them. That's a really big population. And I think one of the opportunities in front of all of us is to figure out a way in which we can actually help a broader group of society gain access to the power structures of society. And I think if we can really tackle that as a problem collectively as journalism and as citizens, that can go a long way towards democracy. I will say also, on this topic of fake news, I get uncomfortable when we talk about fake news almost as its own construct, because I find it dangerous. And it's dangerous not sort of within the construct of what fake news is. It's the effect of what fake news could be on the role of media and free discourse in society. If you think about this not from a journalism point of view or from a content point of view, but in every democracy around the world, legislatures have gotten together to say there's got to be rules and restrictions on who actually controls and owns the media. There's always been restrictions. If the government controls the media, then you know what the outcome of the media is going to be. If only large corporations control it and consolidate power, you may be locking in the control of discourse in a very, very consolidated point of view.
Wouldn't you argue that that's been an ongoing problem with media in the US?
Yeah, it's been a problem, but here's the opportunity. One of the great things about Twitter, one of the great things about social media, it's now so easy to publish content. It's now never been more accessible to consume content, and it's amidst the fact that we have these extraordinary platforms where conversations can take place, that the lines between sort of serious, well-reported journalism and just opinion can get blurred. And I think it's for that reason that publications like what we're doing at HuffPost, what John is doing in his organization, all of us are spending a lot of time making very deep investments in our core identity as a brand. It's it has to matter. It's no coincidence that the New York Times is taking commercials out for the first time ever. It's no coincidence that all of us are saying who are we? Why are we relevant? Why do we matter? Because when you get to know who we are and what role we want to play in society, then you can make a decision whether this is an entity you want to get behind or this is an entity you don't want to get behind.
So, and this is really important because remember, conventional wisdom 3-4 years ago at the dawn of sort of the rise of social media was the brands don't matter anymore. News brands don't matter. People don't care what they click on. They're clicking on individual stories. We know now that actually people do pay attention who's disseminating the information. And guess what? They should. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing sort of a Trump bump in subscriptions. People are also getting hip to the fact that guess what? Quality journalism isn't free, and we're going to need to have a diversified revenue strategy to actually just make sure the business model of journalism gets fixed, because that's actually really important to the maintenance of democracy as well. And in a macro sense, I always believe that American people are smart but not necessarily informed. And one of the things that has driven, I think, the divisions in our country is the death of local media. We have watched local paper after local paper get killed. Pretty soon we'll have a first state that doesn't have a local paper. And yes, citizen journalists can supplement that a little bit, but it's really hard to hold state legislators accountable. And guess what? Those are usually hotbeds of corruption, spoiler alert. And so the more all of a sudden that folks don't have local media looking out for them, the more they're likely to feel a sense of you're parachuting in and doing anthropological studies of my town, Washington Post or New York Times or whatever, and that builds a sense of distrust, even where there maybe should not be distrust. So that's why it's got to be a multifaceted pushback. And this is all happening at a time, not just accusations of fake news from the federal government, but Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, saying this past weekend that the White House has looked at cracking down on libel laws. There are constitutional structures that protect us. The Constitution doesn't mention political parties; it does mention the press. But this is really urgent on every front, and we've got to analyze how we got here and start pushing back across the board. People supporting quality journalism, locally or nationally, advertisers and corporate citizens, consciously whitelisting quality journalism, those are all going to be pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, so, in that regard, actually, there's further challenges because as John alluded to, but just to be explicit about it, when you factor in the business models that are driving journalism, that adds an extra level of pressure in terms of how do journalistic enterprise deliver their best quality work. And specifically, if you're ad-supported as a business model, we're also living in a day and age where brands really care a lot about where they're associated, what content they're being placed against. And so, maintaining the integrity of the journalism, but also sort of getting brands to feel comfortable of getting behind the actual business model, we're seeing some pressure there across the industry.
And there's a catch-22 there that's really important for folks to understand. On the one hand, people are reading news more often than ever before, right? And if you're an advertiser, you want to reach, educated, influential readers. Quality news creates a quality readership. That should be a good transaction of value, right? But what's very tempting for brands to say that hard news is unsafe because the environment is so polarized. That if it's politics or if it's dealing with real world threats like terrorism or anything else, that negativity could be brand unsafe. And if folks start taking that decision, guess what? We will start getting more focus on entertainment news and sports news and less hard news. That itself is also dangerous for democracy because at some point it becomes bread and circuses like the Romans had to deal with. It's something to distract people, to give the illusion of news without the reality of news. So that's a real danger we need to deal with as well.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. And I mean, we can honestly host an hour-long panel on that and that alone. And it's not just something that you're seeing in traditional media or print media, cable news. It's something that we're experiencing in digital news as well. I host the Young Turks, it's an independent news source, and now all of a sudden advertisers are pulling out of YouTube because of the previous model that allowed their ads to do either pre-roll or post-roll on hate speech. And so now they've gone in a completely different direction where they're like, we don't want to be on any political content, we don't want to be on any type of sexual content, even if it's just sex education. And so there are legitimate sources out there that are trying to make a living independent independently, I should say, that are getting hit by the emergence of fake news, the emergence of hate speech, the polarization that we're experiencing in politics right now. It's honestly a nightmare, and it's really difficult to adapt to that. But what are the answers? Because you mentioned whitelisting.
Sure.
And so right now there's, this pressure on Silicon Valley CEOs, Mark Zuckerberg. He has a moral obligation to do something about fake news. And the question is, what does he do? How do you mitigate this issue or solve this issue without, creeping into First Amendment, violation territory, right? That's what I'm most concerned about. So Jared, I'm gonna let you take this one.
Sure. So I think one thing to point out, and I do think there's an obligation of all the stakeholders in the industry to actually solve this problem, because I think underlying it is what John has eloquently articulated, is we believe in a world where there should be free speech and there should be an outlet for discourse. So if that's the table stakes assumption, we all need to get together, whether you're Facebook, Google, or us at HuffPost. But one thing to note is that as a distributor, distributors who've got power always play this role in terms of what is being shown and what is not being shown. That's no different than at any point in the history of media where there's been a few outlets that have the vast majority of people on those outlets, and they determine what gets shown. And so there is always this level of editing, and that's taking place because there's only so much time and so much outlet, and they're making decisions. One could make a decision, don't put news content and put some other content like games, which is what Facebook used to do. So I think there is this obligation, but I think we shouldn't kid ourselves in the sense that this kind of editorial thing has not been part of the equation. It's always been part of the equation, as far as I can tell.
It's scary to, name someone as the arbiter of who decides, which news source is credible, which is fake, which has bad intentions. You never want to put that much power in the hands of one person, especially when it comes to an outlet like Facebook. And look, Facebook is exploring lots of different options. It's not like they're going to have Mark Zuckerberg look at all these sources and make the decision. But I do worry a little bit about whitelisting as well, because whitelisting certainly does benefit media outlets that have been around for a while, that have been established. But what about up-and-coming news outlets that have the best intentions? How do we answer that question?
Look, I think it requires a degree of flexibility and transparency. And that, we're always going to have a who will watch the Watchmen kind of problem. But one of the ways to address that is to really take advantage of the democratization of information and make sure that people can petition to get in, that what the parameters are is clearly constructed, and it's not simply a black box that doesn't allow anybody entry, no ability to petition. That's a dangerous scenario. But I think also the little d democratization of media is something we need to take advantage of. We can't wait for one person to come save us, whether it's the President of the United States or Mark Zuckerberg. The thing about being a democracy is ultimately we the people are the backstop. It requires vigorous citizenship, and you vote with your eyeballs and your wallet every day. And to actually take some of the action like Sleeping Giants did with Breitbart, which was enormously effective. And again, it's not about politics per se, right? It's simply that if advertisers want to support a conservative outlet, maybe they should advertise it with, say, National Review or the Weekly Standard, and not people, who are intentionally trying to inflame divisions. And have black crime tags on their stories, as one example with Breitbart, or MASH notes of the Confederate flag, or any example you want to take. At least then it's an exercise of the democratic impulse. What I think the larger point is that corporate citizens, consumers, businesses, we all need to recognize that we have an obligation to be part of the solution here, and it's not going to be pure and it's not going to be simple. But I just wrote a book about George Washington's farewell address, and one of the points he was making is that enlightened opinion is necessary to a self-governing society. Enlightened opinion. I mean, this is basic to democracy. And if you want to pull all the way out, one of the challenges we're seeing to liberal democracy as a concept is countries who are trying to weaken faith in liberal institutions, like the press, like the integrity of democracy, and that's a strategy on their part. So we really have to, have a rally around the flag pushback on that. as citizens, as businesses.
Here's something cool and related to your enlightenment concept. One of the products that we're working on at HuffPost to get at your question is really cool. It's in a beta phase. We call it Flipside. And essentially what we do is for articles that we publish and that are published in the world, what we try and do is contextualize it within the broader ecosystem of the issue. And what we've done is we've tried to look at like Twitter's API and other social APIs and say, for this topic, where this article is on the spectrum relative to where the world population on the social medias are, it like skews kind of left, it skews right, it skews left of center. The majority of activity taking place in social media as it relates to this specific topic is over here, and this article is here. So people can actually sort of have a mind map and conceptualize like, hey, this article is here, the world seems to be over here, and I can at least start having a perspective on where my thought process is in relation to where all the pockets of conversation around the issue is.
Right.
So it essentially maps the ideological component of the article written.
Now,
So-
and it's not pure science. Like we do take a lot of data from social feeds, but it requires some editorial curation of like how you actually get the map. But it's like a step in the direction of trying to give people context for where issues are and where your thoughts are in relationship to those issues.
Yeah, and look, but there too, getting the inputs right are going to be important because conservatives are always going to say the Daily Beast is liberal, no matter how many conservative columnists we have, and we consciously try to balance.
Yeah.
And some
and
folks,
liberals are going to say that it's
exactly
pretty conservative.
Right. And that's that in my view, that probably means we're doing it about right. But it's really important to start getting a sense of, are you getting a balanced news diet? How can we communicate to people so that they have a sense of, am I just getting self-reinforcing messages that may have less and less to do with reality, and not over-index, just because someone's drinking the Kool-Aid doesn't mean we need to address the definition of reality to meet halfway to their worldview. I mean, there is such a thing as facts, and we need to assert that. My favorite quote that I cannot quote enough is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, not their own facts. And that's an important part of what we have to do as journalists right now, is really aggressively embrace that ideal without apology. And to make sure that we're being fair and to understand that our credibility comes from our ability to criticize from a position of independence, but that we can't let the tail wag the dog in these important civic debates. We've got to play our game.
Well, we're out
That's
of
what we're
time,
doing at the beach.
unfortunately, and I don't want to get beaten off the stage. We got threatened back there.
They threatened us earlier.
They did. But, I just want to leave you all with this. I know that this is an incredibly smart audience, and, you're savvy, you know how to tell the difference between fake news and real news. But, do your part. If you notice anyone in your personal life that's sharing content that's intentionally misleading and it's propaganda, talk to them in the nicest way possible. Don't confront them, because that doesn't work. And let them know, hey, this doesn't seem right. Here's another source that's a little more credible. Here's what the reality is of the story. We're all responsible for fighting back and pushing back against what happened during this past election and what surely will continue to happen unless we find ways to solve it.
That's right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for reading the Beast, too.